October 1066. A weary king stands on Senlac Ridge, his eyes hollowed by 400 miles of forced march, his army collapsing from exhaustion before the battle even begins. Harold Godwinson cannot rest. He can barely stand, but he can still fight, and that is enough to defend a throne won by a broken oath. With trembling hands he grips his standard. He knows this moment will define him. He knows it will destroy everything he swore to protect. And yet he holds his ground anyway. William shall never wear the crown. The Duke he once called brother-in-arms, the lord who sheltered him when shipwreck cast him on Norman shores, the man whose hospitality he repaid with betrayal. Tonight, that former ally becomes the conqueror he must defeat before exhaustion defeats him.
And the question that haunts history is this: how does a king convince himself that breaking the most sacred oath of his life is an act of duty, not treachery? Before we descend into Harold's final hours, before we uncover the hidden truth behind the oath that changed England forever, subscribe to Hidden Crowns, where we shatter the myths, expose the concealed chronicles, and reveal the human desperation that 1066 tried to bury. Because Harold's doom was not born on that battlefield.
Harold Godwinson was never meant to die on a battlefield. He was meant to rule. He was intelligent, charismatic, a born warrior with the kind of loyalty that made men follow him willingly. England adored him long before he wore the crown. But he carried a burden Henry VIII or Richard II would one day share, a promise he never should have made. Years before Harold became king, he was shipwrecked on Norman shores and taken to the court of Duke William. There, under circumstances shrouded in ambiguity and political pressure, Harold swore an oath on holy relics no less, to support William's claim to the English throne. It was an oath made in a moment of vulnerability, an oath likely extracted through coercion, an oath Harold never intended to honor. But in the medieval world, breaking an oath sworn before God was more than dishonesty.
It was treason against heaven itself, and William never forgot it. When Edward the Confessor died and Harold took the crown for himself, William viewed it not as politics, but as betrayal. Harold's reign was doomed before it even began.
Yet Harold did not simply inherit a crown. He inherited a fractured kingdom. Like Richard II centuries later, Harold ascended the throne at a moment when England trembled beneath crisis. The North stirred with rebellion. Vikings still dreamed of English conquest. Powerful nobles doubted the crown. Foreign enemies watched for weakness. Harold did not have the luxury of caution. He needed to hold England together through force of will alone. And he tried. God, he tried. He outmatched rebellions with relentless speed. He built alliances through marriage. He restored order across the country. He crushed threats before they fully bloomed. Harold Godwinson was not drifting toward fate. He was fighting tooth and nail against it. But the tragedy of kingship is that sometimes effort becomes the very thing that destroys you. Harold's determination became desperation.
His loyalty to England became an inflexible pride, and like Richard II, who clung to the idea of divine kingship until it strangled him, Harold clung to the belief that he alone could protect his kingdom, a belief that led him straight into a trap.
In 1066, England faced the nightmare scenario, 2 invasions arriving at once. From the south, William of Normandy, coming to enforce the oath he believed Harold had violated. From the north, Harald Hardrada of Norway, accompanied by Harold's own rebellious brother Tostig. Harold was forced into an impossible choice: defend the crown against the man he betrayed, or protect the kingdom from Viking fire. He chose England. He marched north, fast, furious, decisive, and crushed the invaders at Stamford Bridge in one of the most exhausting battles in medieval history. It was a victory worthy of legend. But victories have consequences. Harold's army was battered, bleeding, and exhausted. He had barely finished burying the dead when news arrived that William had landed in the south. Harold had no choice. He marched again. 200 miles in less than 2 weeks. No rest.
No food. No time to rebuild the shield wall that protected England for centuries. He fought the greatest threats of his age back to back. How could any king, even one as valiant as Harold, emerge from that alive?
Harold Godwinson did not lose at Hastings because he lacked courage. He lost because he had none to spare. Courage wasted, strength spent, a king running on the last embers of willpower. And like Richard II during the Peasants' Revolt, standing alone on a field surrounded by enemies, trying to command a storm he could not control, Harold found himself facing a fate he no longer had the strength to outrun. The Norman cavalry circled, the Saxon lines trembled, the shield wall, the ancient backbone of Anglo-Saxon defense, cracked under the weight of exhaustion. Harold fought anyway. He fought because he believed a king must. He fought because he refused to let William's claim define history. He fought because breaking his oath did not mean he would break his country. But fate does not care for bravery. Exhaustion does not bend to will.
And destiny, once aimed, always finds its mark. With an arrow, with a fall, with the end of an era.
To understand Harold Godwinson's fall, you must first understand his greatest flaw. He believed England could be saved through sheer force of will. This was not arrogance. This was faith, the deadly, blinding kind. Harold believed that if he stood firm enough, fought hard enough, moved fast enough, the world would bend rather than break. He trusted endurance more than diplomacy, action more than calculation. And like every tragic king before him, Richard II with his divine entitlement, Edward II with his misguided loyalty, Harold never realized that kings do not rule alone. They rule through balance, between mercy and force, between exhaustion and restraint, between duty and self-preservation. Harold pushed himself past every limit until there was nothing left to give. But his enemies had not run a marathon across England. They were fresh. They were hungry.
And one of them, William of Normandy, had been preparing for this moment for years.
William had waited a lifetime for his chance. He was the bastard of Normandy, raised in a court of daggers and whispers, a man who carved power through brutality and survival rather than birthright. Unlike Harold, William did not trust fate. He shaped it. When Harold broke the oath sworn over sacred relics, William did not rage. He planned. He gathered allies, secured papal approval, and convinced Europe that his cause was righteous. He painted Harold as a liar, a usurper, a king whose hands were already stained with betrayal before his crown touched his head. And the church listened, because a king who breaks an oath is a king who forfeits heaven's protection. When William stepped onto English soil, he did so not just as an invader, but as God's avenger, or so the banners claimed.
Harold may have been the rightful king in England, but William became the rightful king in the eyes of history. That is the difference between the two men. Harold possessed courage. William possessed a narrative, and in the medieval world, narrative was power. Harold's greatest military mistake was not a tactical misstep on the battlefield. It was the decision he made off the battlefield, the decision to march his battered, exhausted army south immediately after Stamford Bridge. He could have rested. He could have rebuilt the shield wall. He could have forced William to starve through winter. Instead, he pushed onward, propelled by urgency, by duty, by a king's guilt for a broken promise, and perhaps by a desire to end the conflict before his own strength gave out. It was a heroic decision. It was also a fatal one. Men limped after their king, feet blistered, armor dented, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Harold rode at the front, his face carved by determination, his leadership unquestioned, his humanity laid bare.
This was a king who led not from behind banners, but from the dirt and sweat of the battlefield.
And that is precisely why England loved him, and why fate punished him. History has a cruel pattern. The kings who fight beside their soldiers die beside them too.
On the eve of Hastings, two camps faced each other beneath a blood-red sky. In the Norman camp, William feasted. He spoke to his men of destiny and oaths, of vengeance and divine justice. A papal banner fluttered above him, the church itself blessing his conquest. In the Saxon camp, Harold did not feast. He stood with weary soldiers, shared plain food and short, heavy words, and walked the lines in silence. He knew the men beside him were beyond tired, beyond fear, beyond mortal limits. Yet they would stand with him, because he was their king and their hope. The contrast could not have been sharper. William had preparation. Harold had loyalty. William had God on parchment. Harold had England in his hands. Which one was stronger? The dawn would decide.
When the battle began on October 14th, 1066, the Saxon shield wall rose like a woken creature, ancient, impenetrable, and terrifying. It was England's pride, England's backbone, England's legacy. And for hours, it held. William's archers failed. His infantry faltered. His cavalry smashed against the Saxon ranks and shattered like waves on stone. There was a moment, a single trembling moment, when it seemed Harold might win. But exhaustion always demands a price. A rumor spread. William was dead. Norman lines began to break. And then William did something Harold lacked the energy to do. He transformed defeat into strategy. He lifted his helmet, showed his face, and rallied his men. Then came the feigned retreat, the cruel brilliance of Norman warfare. Saxon soldiers, exhausted and desperate for an end, broke formation to chase the retreating Normans. The shield wall cracked. Not from force, from human weakness. Harold watched it happen. He saw the line falter, saw men stumble, saw the first fissures in the defense of England. And he knew this was the price of fatigue. This was the consequence of marching too far, too fast, too long. This was the fate he had been running from since the day he took the crown. Even kings cannot outrun exhaustion. As the shield wall broke, Harold did not run. He gathered the men still standing, held the ridge, and fought like a man who understood that the ground beneath his feet was more than earth. It was England itself. William's cavalry surged. The air filled with arrows. The field turned to mud and blood beneath the pounding of hooves. And Harold, refusing to yield, refusing to break, refusing to accept defeat, stood at the center of the chaos like a spear thrust into the heart of fate. This was no longer a battle. It was a reckoning. Harold had tried to save a kingdom through effort alone, but strength cannot defeat destiny. Endurance cannot defeat inevitability, and a king cannot rule without rest. In the clash between exhaustion and ambition, only exhaustion survives. And so destiny took aim and released its arrow, the arrow that would rewrite England forever. The arrow struck with such brutal precision that it felt almost symbolic, as if destiny itself had been waiting for this moment, patiently drawing its bow through years of ambition, betrayal, exhaustion, and war. Harold staggered where he stood, the sky spinning above him in a haze of blue and smoke. For a heartbeat he remained upright, as if refusing to accept that this piercing, intimate violence was how a king's story should end. Then his knees buckled. The ridge of Senlac Hill tilted beneath him. Voices blurred into chaos. He pressed his palm to his face, touched the shaft of the arrow buried in his eye, and let out a sound no chronicle truly records, a sound of disbelief, of fury, of heartbreak. As he fell,
The Saxon line finally collapsed. What remained of England, its warriors, its dreams, its ancient identity, was swallowed by the Norman tide. And in that fall, in that single tragic moment, the world shifted. The Norman conquest was no longer a threat. It was a reality. Harold Godwinson, last king of the Anglo-Saxons, died on foreign blades in his own country because he ran too far, fought too hard, carried too much, and believed too deeply. There are kings who die in glory, kings who die in disgrace, and kings who die in silence. Harold died in agony, but also in defiance, a king destroyed not by cowardice, but by the simple, devastating fact that human strength has limits.
After Harold fell, the battlefield became a charnel house. William's soldiers hacked at the bodies, searching for the king among the fallen. They feared Harold had survived, that legend would rise from the dead and haunt them. When they finally found him, or what they believed was him, the corpse was mangled beyond recognition. It was Harold's mistress, Edith Swanneck, who identified him, not by his face, but by marks only a lover could know. History merely records tenderness, but in this moment, amid the carnage and smoke, love broke through. Edith touched what remained of her king and said simply, "This is Harold." The body was handed over, buried without honor, buried without ceremony, buried without the dignity once promised to kings. Some whispered that William ordered him buried on the shore, to watch over the land he failed to defend. Others said he was thrown into a shallow grave like any common soldier. No one knows for certain. But the truth is this: Harold Godwinson, a man who held the throne for barely 9 months, was swallowed by mud and forgotten by stone. The last Anglo-Saxon king died as the first victim of Norman England, and history moved on as if he had never existed. Harold's death did not merely end a battle, it ended a civilization. The old laws, the old language, the old nobility, the old culture, all were swept away. Norman rule built a new England, one of castles and clerks, of French-speaking kings, a feudal hierarchy. The world Harold died to protect vanished within a generation. And here lies the ultimate tragedy. Harold was fighting not just for a crown, but for a way of life already doomed. His courage could not save it. His sacrifice could not preserve it. His death could not alter the future. William the Conqueror inherited England, but Harold Godwinson became its ghost, the shadow behind the tapestry of the bayou, the silent presence in every old hill and battlefield, the king whose legacy was buried but never erased. The Normans built a new world on the bones of the old one, and Harold is the foundation they never mention. When we study Harold's tragedy, it becomes impossible not to see the echo of another doomed king, Richard II. Both men believed they could hold a fractured kingdom together through sheer force of conviction. Both ignored warnings, misread enemies, and clung to a belief that destiny would protect them. Both fell not because they lacked strength, but because they trusted the wrong truth. Richard believed kingship was divine. Harold believed endurance was enough. Richard was imprisoned and murdered. Harold was struck down on the battlefield. And both men, centuries apart, shared the same fatal flaw. They believed they were stronger than fate. Fate delights in proving kings wrong. For centuries after his death, rumors whispered that Harold had survived Hastings. Some claimed he lived as a hermit. Others said he sailed to Scandinavia. Some swore he returned in disguise to wander the land he once ruled. It was hope speaking, not truth. A kingdom that lost its identity in a single afternoon needed to imagine that its king still lived somewhere beneath the horizon. A nation does not let go of its past so easily. Harold Godwinson became not a memory, but a symbol of resistance, of loyalty, of a world stolen too soon. Even now, nearly 1,000 years later,
his story still evokes a strange ache, the ache of a turning point in history where everything familiar vanished. Harold did not just lose a crown, he lost against England, and England lost itself.
So what do we learn from Harold Godwinson? Was he a fool who broke an oath he should have honored? Was he a hero who fought until his final breath? Was he a victim of a kingdom too fractured to save? Or was he a king destroyed by the same thing that destroys so many rulers, the belief that duty requires sacrifice, even when that sacrifice becomes self-destruction? Look deeper, and you see a truth darker than the Bayeux Tapestry depicts. Harry did not die because William was stronger. Harold died because he was tired. And sometimes, the greatest kings fall not with betrayal, not with cowardice, but with exhaustion.
Is bravery still virtue when it becomes suicide? Is loyalty still noble when it blinds you to danger? Is destiny truly destiny if it's shaped by a king's refusal to rest? These are the questions Harold leaves behind, questions that echo across every throne, every battlefield, every moment where power demands more than a single man can give. Harold Godwinson's reign was brief. His death was brutal. His legacy was buried under Norman stone. But his story? His story refuses to vanish. Because Harold is the king who reminds us that heroism is fragile, that duty can be deadly, and that even the greatest warriors break. No crown is worth the destruction of the man who wears it. And no king, no matter how brave, can outrun an arrow carved by fate.
If this story made you see history differently, tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns. Because the past is full of kings who believed they could defy destiny, and every crown casts a shadow.